I found myself sitting in front of the notes I'd taken during that analysis, thinking about how to build a genuinely new story on that same skeleton. New people, new place, new secret, same slow burn structure. Given the length involved to 5,500 words, this is a substantial piece of creative writing, and I want to make sure I get the pacing and beats right rather than rushing it. A quick note before I write it. I'll build this as a first-person story narrated by a man in his 60s, addressing the audience the way this genre typically does as you, like he's talking to people who understand him, occasionally invoking friend or listener style direct address rather than generic narration. New characters, new town, new secret. I'll use a hidden inheritance, land deed mystery instead of a paternity mystery, per the recommendation to keep the ambiguous secret engine but change its mechanism. Same emotional arc. Quiet. Wronged father figure, cruel wealthy in-law, a grandchild caught in the middle, a 16 months in the making reversal. Let me write the full story now. 6:15 in the morning, and I found my son sitting on the curb outside his own house, a duffel bag between his boots, and his little girl's stuffed rabbit clutched in his fist like it was the only solid thing left in the world. I didn't say anything at first. I just parked the truck across the street, the way I'd parked it 100 times before to pick him up from football practice, from prom, from the hospital the night his daughter was born. And I sat there for a second, watching him not look up. Because a man who's just had everything he built taken from him doesn't look up right away. He looks at the ground like the ground is the only thing that hasn't lied to him yet. My name's Walton Reese, 63 years old, retired now, though I spent 31 years running heavy equipment for the county before my knees gave out and told me otherwise. I've buried a wife, raised a son mostly alone after that, and I thought I really believed that the hardest chapter of my life was behind me. I was wrong. It was just getting started. My boy's name is Caleb. Good kid. Better man. He married a woman named Vivian 11 years ago, and Vivian's daddy is a man named Preston Calloway, the kind of man who owns half the commercial real estate in 3 counties and never once, in 11 years, looked at my son like he was worth the dirt on his boots. Preston didn't come to the wedding reception. Sent a card. A check, too, which Caleb tried to give back and Vivian begged him not to, because refusing Calloway money was, in that family, its own kind of insult. I want you to understand something about Preston Calloway before I go any further, because you're going to need to understand exactly what kind of man we're dealing with here. He wasn't loud. He wasn't the type to raise his voice or throw a punch. Men like that are easy, you see them coming. Preston was worse. Preston was patient. And Preston was precise. And Preston believed, all the way down in his bones, that anything he'd paid for, he owned, including, eventually, his own daughter's marriage. Caleb worked as a high school shop teacher, 12 years teaching kids how to weld and frame houses and respect a table saw, in a town that still had exactly one good diner and a water tower with the school mascot painted on the side. He loved it. He was good at it, the kind of teacher former students still wave at from truck windows a decade later. But in Preston's eyes, my son teaching shop class to farm kids was one notch above collecting cans on the roadside. He needs a real career, Preston told me once. At a Thanksgiving I still regret attending. Something with a future. Something that matches what my daughter's used to. I didn't say what I wanted to say. I smiled, the way you do at family dinners when you've decided the turkey isn't worth the argument, and I passed him the gravy. But I watched. That's the thing about men like me, men who spent 3 decades reading the ground before they moved 1,000 tons of it, checking for the soft spot before they trusted their weight to it. I watched Preston for years. I watched how he'd hand Caleb opportunities that always somehow required Caleb to answer to him. I watched how he'd praise Vivian in front of Caleb and then, quiet, in the kitchen where he thought nobody was listening, tell her she'd married beneath herself. I watched, and 16 months before that morning on the curb, I started preparing. Let me back up further, though, because you deserve the whole shape of it, not just the ending. Caleb and Vivian had a daughter, Josephine. We all just called her Josie, who was 7 years old and had my late wife's exact laugh, which is a strange and wonderful and sometimes painful thing to hear come out of a child who never met her. Josie was the center of everything. She was the reason Caleb put up with Preston's condescension for as long as he did, because Preston, whatever his faults, doted on that little girl, and Caleb didn't want to be the reason his daughter lost a grandfather. That's a decent instinct. It's also exactly the kind of decency a man like Preston Calloway learns to use as a leash. About 2 years ago, Preston made Caleb an offer. Said he wanted to bring him into the family business Callaway Properties as a community liaison. Fancy title. Real job was something closer to a mascot. Show up to town council meetings, shake hands, be the friendly, humble schoolteacher face that made Callaway's strip mall developments and land buyouts look less like a rich man swallowing a small town whole and more like neighbors helping neighbors. Caleb wasn't stupid. He knew what it was. But the pay was double his teaching salary, and Vivian was pregnant again. By then, we didn't know yet that pregnancy would end in a loss that broke something quiet in both of them. And Preston kept saying the same 4 words every time Caleb hesitated. Do it for Josie. Caleb took the job. No contract, just a handshake and Preston's word, because Preston said contracts were for people who don't trust family, which is the kind of thing a man only says when the lack of a contract benefits him and not you. I told Caleb to get it in writing. He told me Preston would be offended. I told him, a man who gets offended by a contract is telling you exactly what he plans to do to you later. Caleb didn't listen. Not because he was foolish, but because he loved his wife and his daughter, and he was tired, so tired, of being the reason there was tension at the table. I understood that. I'd been that tired myself. Once. But understanding it didn't stop the cold feeling in my gut every time I watched Preston shake my son's hand a little too firm, like he was checking how much give was left in it. So I started paying attention to things Caleb wasn't paying attention to. The deed on the little house Caleb and Vivian lived in, for one, the one Preston had gifted them as a wedding present, the one everybody assumed was theirs free and clear. I asked Caleb once, real casual, over coffee, whether he had the deed paperwork anywhere. Preston handles all that, he said. Vivian's family thing. I don't want to step on it. Friend, if you take one thing from everything I'm about to tell you, take this. When it comes to the roof over your children's heads, you step on it. You step on it with both boots, and you don't apologize for the footprints. I didn't push Caleb. Pushing Caleb never worked. The boy dug in like a fence post when he felt cornered, just like his mother used to. Instead, I did what I'd always done best. I went quiet, and I went looking. Took me 4 months just to get a certified copy of the deed from the county recorder's office, because Preston, being Preston, he had structured the whole thing through one of his holding companies, instead of a simple gift transfer, which meant the house wasn't in Caleb and Vivian's names at all. It was in the name of Callaway Family Holdings LLC, with Caleb and Vivian listed only as permitted occupants, a phrase that should chill any parent to the bone, because permitted occupants can be unpermitted, told to leave, handed a box and a deadline. I sat with that piece of paper at my kitchen table for a long time. I thought about telling Caleb right then. I really did. But I knew my son, and I knew that if I told him his own father-in-law had quietly built himself a legal trapdoor under his family's feet, Caleb would do something honest and hot-headed, confront Preston directly, demand answers, maybe even walk out on the job in a blaze of righteous anger that would feel wonderful for about a day and then leave his wife and daughter with nothing. Preston would have loved that. A man like Preston wants you angry, because angry men make mistakes, and mistakes are opportunities for men who already hold every card. So I decided, God forgive me if it was the wrong call, that I would not hand my son a reason to fight. I would build him a way to win instead. For the next year, I did the slow, unglamorous, invisible work that nobody claps for. I took my pension savings, not a fortune, but enough, because I'd lived careful my whole life, driven the same truck for 14 years, never once bought something just because I could, and I hired an attorney out of the county seat, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Denise Okafor who didn't blink twice at the size of what I was asking her to untangle. We pulled every document Callaway Family Holdings had filed with the county for the past 6 years. We found that Preston hadn't just structured the house that way, he'd done the same thing with a piece of land 2 miles out, 40 acres that used to belong to Vivian's late mother's family, land that, by the terms of her mother's original will, was never supposed to pass through Preston's hands at all. It was supposed to go directly to Vivian, and eventually to Josie. Preston had spent years quietly maneuvering it into the LLC anyway, using a probate loophole and Vivian's own trusting signature on paperwork she likely never read closely, the way none of us read closely the documents put in front of us by people we love. That land was worth more than the house, more than Caleb's salary for the next 20 years combined. And Preston had been sitting on it, using it as collateral for a strip mall development 3 towns over, treating his own granddaughter's inheritance like it was his personal poker chip. I want to be honest with you here, because I promised myself I would be honest through every part of this story. There were nights I wanted to drive straight to Preston's big house on the hill and lay that deed on his dinner table and watch his face. I wanted it badly. But Denise kept telling me the same thing, over and over, until it finally sank into my thick skull. Walton, you only get to do this once. If you move too soon, he'll have time to cover his tracks. Let him think he's already won. So I waited. 16 months, start to finish, of quiet phone calls, of certified letters, of a paper trail built brick by brick while Preston Calloway strutted around town like a man who'd already claimed every inch of it. And then came the morning on the curb. What happened, as I pieced it together later from Caleb and from Vivian, was this. Preston had asked Caleb no, told Caleb to stand up at a town council meeting and publicly support a zoning change that would let Calloway Properties bulldoze 6 blocks of old family-owned storefronts downtown, including the hardware store where half the men in town had bought their first ladder and their first wedding ring case. Caleb, my son, my good and steady boy, stood up in front of that council and said he couldn't do it. Said it wasn't right. Said the town deserved better than being sold out from under it by people who'd never had to sweep the floor of a business they built with their own hands. Preston didn't yell at the meeting. Like I said, he never yelled. He waited until they were home, until Josie was asleep, and then he called Caleb into that big house on the hill and told him, calm as anything, that a man who wouldn't support his own family didn't get to live under his family's roof. Told him he had until morning. Vivian, God bless her, tried to stand between them. Told her father he was being cruel. Told him this was her house too, her daughter's house. Preston told her. And I only found out what he actually said weeks later, when Vivian finally repeated it to me with her voice shaking that it had never been her house. Never been Caleb's house. That the deed said what it said, and love didn't change a signature. So Caleb packed a bag, woke his daughter gently, the way I taught him to when she was a baby and colicky, and the only thing that worked was moving slow and talking soft. Carried her stuffed rabbit out to the porch steps with 2 suitcases, because Vivian, torn in half between her husband and her father, told him she needed a night to think, to talk to Preston, to figure out what was even legally true, and Caleb, because he is a better man than his father-in-law will ever understand, he didn't want to make her choose in the heat of the moment. He went to sit on the porch to wait for the sun, and to call me. I got that call at 5:40 in the morning. I was already awake. Some part of me, I think, had been waiting 16 months for that phone to ring. Dad, he said, and his voice had that flatness in it, that scraped-out sound of a man trying not to fall apart in front of his sleeping daughter. Preston's putting us out. I don't even know if I have anywhere to take her. You have somewhere, I told him. You have me. Get in the truck, son. I'm already coming. That's the whole of it, the phrase that started this. 4 words I've said to that boy his whole life. From Little League games that ran late to a bar fight in his 20s I still won't tell the full story of, to that morning on the curb. Get in the truck, son. Whatever's happened, whatever's broken, get in the truck, and let's go figure it out where it's safe. I pulled up. I didn't say much. I looked at Josie, half asleep against her daddy's shoulder, that rabbit dangling from her fist, and something in my chest went very quiet and very hard, the way it does. Right before you make a decision, you've already made 100 times in your head, and now finally get to make with your hands. Get in, I said. Both of you. I drove them to my place. Made Josie pancakes because pancakes fix more childhood mornings than people give them credit for, and let her fall back asleep on my couch, under the quilt my late wife made, while Caleb sat at my kitchen table with his head in his hands, not talking, just breathing. And then I made a phone call. Not to Preston, to Denise. It's time, I told her. Here's what Preston Calloway did not know. Standing in his big house on the hill, feeling like a man who'd just successfully evicted his own son-in-law with nothing but a stern voice and a locked door. He did not know that Denise and I had spent the past 4 months quietly, legally, patiently filing a formal claim on behalf of Josephine, a minor beneficiary claim, backed by her late great-grandmother's original will, asserting that the 40 acres Preston had folded into Calloway family holdings had never legally been his to fold in. He did not know that a probate judge 2 counties over had already reviewed our filing and scheduled an emergency hearing for the following week, specifically because the claim involved a minor's inheritance and the judge, a sharp old woman named Judge Marisol Feng, who had 0 patience for wealthy men treating trusts like personal checking accounts, wanted it resolved fast. He did not know that I had, 11 months earlier, quietly bought the small strip of land directly bordering his planned development site, the land his engineers needed for a required access road, the one piece he hadn't managed to acquire because the previous owner, an old widower named Harlan Voss, had refused to sell to Callaway at any price out of decades-old spite over a decision from Preston's own father back in the 80s. Harlan sold it to me instead, for a fair price and a promise that I'd never let it fall into Preston Callaway's hands. I meant that promise with everything in me. Without that access road, Preston's strip mall development, the one he'd used the LLC held land as collateral against, the one he'd bullied my son into publicly endorsing at a town meeting, could not move forward, not without my permission, and I had no intention of giving it. He did not know any of that, sitting in his big house, thinking he'd won. The following Tuesday, Preston got 2 certified letters in the same mail delivery. One was the notice of the emergency probate hearing regarding his granddaughter's inheritance. The other was from my attorney, informing him that the access easement he'd been assuming, the one his own engineers had penciled into the development plans without ever actually securing my signature, was not available, effective immediately, and any further encroachment onto my property line would be treated as trespass. I heard, secondhand, that Preston showed up at my door that same afternoon, red in the face for the first time in 11 years of knowing him. I wasn't home. Caleb was Caleb, Vivian, and Josie had been staying with me for 4 days by then, and Caleb told me later that Preston stood on my porch and demanded to know what kind of games I was playing. My son, God bless him, said something I don't think Preston expected. He said, "You threw me out of a house I thought was mine, Preston. Turns out neither of us actually owned it the way we thought. Funny how that works." Preston left without another word. The hearing itself, the following week, didn't take long. Denise laid out the paper trail plainly. The original will, the probate loophole, the timeline of transfers, all of it, and Judge Feng, who I later learned had little tolerance for exactly this kind of maneuvering, ruled that the 40 acres reverted to a trust in Josephine's name, to be managed by Vivian as trustee, until Josie turned 25, with Caleb named as co-trustee. Not Preston. Preston was removed from any control of it entirely, and ordered to account for every dollar of collateral value he'd extracted from land that was never his. The house, the one Preston had structured through the LLC, the one he'd used as leverage to throw his own daughter and granddaughter out onto a curb that took a little longer to untangle, but Denise found enough irregularity in the original transfer paperwork that Preston's own lawyers advised him to settle rather than fight it in front of a judge who was already visibly unimpressed with him. He signed the house over to Caleb and Vivian outright, free and clear. No LLC, no permitted occupant clause, no trapdoor. I made sure of the wording myself, sitting beside Denise at that table, reading every single line before I let Caleb sign anything ever again. I won't pretend it fixed everything. Vivian spent a long time afterward caught between grief for the father she thought she had and anger at the one she'd actually gotten. Preston, last I heard, sold off most of his other holdings to cover the losses from the stalled development and moved out of the big house on the hill to somewhere smaller, quieter, a long way from being able to look down on anybody. He tried, twice, to reach out to Vivian. She's spoken to him once, briefly, at a coffee shop, and told me afterward that it felt like talking to a stranger wearing her father's voice. She's not ready for more than that. Maybe she never will be. That's not mine to decide for her. Caleb went back to teaching shop class that fall, told me it was the first time in 2 years he didn't feel like he was performing for somebody else's approval. The kids still wave at him from truck windows. He built Josie a treehouse on the edge of that 40 acres last summer, right near the property line, close enough that on clear evenings you can just barely see the roofline of Preston's old house from the top of it, if you're looking for it. Nobody looks for it anymore. Josie's 8 now. She still has that stuffed rabbit, a little more threadbare than it used to be, sitting on a shelf in her room instead of clutched in her fist on a stranger's porch step. She doesn't remember much about that morning, or says she doesn't, and I've decided that's a mercy I'm grateful for and won't go digging into. Me, I still drive that same truck. 14 years old now, closer to 15. Caleb offered to buy me a new one with some of the money from the settlement, and I told him no, keep it, put it toward Josie's college, because some things aren't about needing a new truck. Some things are about the fact that when your child calls you at 5:40 in the morning with his voice breaking, you want to be sitting in the exact same seat you've always sat in when you tell him to get in. People ask me sometimes, the few who know the whole story, Whether I regret waiting 16 months instead of confronting Preston the moment I found that first deed at my kitchen table. Whether I should have told Caleb sooner, let him make his own choice about it, fought louder and faster instead of quiet and slow. I don't regret it, not for one single day, because here's what I've learned. In 63 years of watching ground before I trusted my weight to it, a loud man can be dangerous for an afternoon. A quiet man, if he's patient enough, if he loves the people he's protecting more than he loves being right in the moment, can be dangerous for exactly as long as it takes to win completely, and not 1 second longer than that. Preston Calloway thought he was the only one in that family who understood power. What he never understood, what men like him rarely do, until it's far too late for the understanding to help them, is that real power was never about the deed to a house, or 40 acres of land, or a strip mall development 3 towns over. Real power was a father in a 14-year-old truck, parked across the street at 6 in the morning, who'd already spent 16 months making sure that when he said get in, there would always be somewhere safe to go,